Some buildings in downtown area are just a single multi-story building designed for labs. So it's almost like a campus, but just a single building. So they are managed with that in mind. There is sufficient loading dock space for deliveries. There's sufficient bulk storage for, nitrogen tanks and helium tanks or whatever. Um, the building floor to floor height is enough for a typical lab user. The structural module, the bay space for the spacing for the structural grid is the right size, because that's another factor. You want to make sure if you're putting lab benches on a floor that you're not interrupted by a column, uh, and minimizing impacting your efficiencies from a layout standpoint. So there's a lot of different factors that go into it. Oftentimes tenants just really like to go into something that's built day one for a lab facility, so they don't have to think too much about it.
Welcome to CRE Radio for influential commercial real estate professionals who work with investors, buyers, and sellers of commercial real estate coast to coast. Whether you're an investor, broker, lender, property manager, attorney, or accountant, we're here to learn from the experts.
Welcome to Commercial Real Estate Pro Network's CRE Radio. Thanks for joining us. My name is J. Darren Gross. This is a podcast focused on commercial real estate investment and risk management strategies. Weekly, we have conversations with commercial real estate investors and professionals who provide their experience and insight to help you grow your real estate portfolio. Today's interview is sponsored by Building Insurance and Risk. When you invest in real estate, it pays to work with a real estate investor protection specialist to protect yourself and your investment from catastrophic loss. The experts at Building Insurance and Risk focus on real estate investor protection. They provide you with multiple insurance coverage offers and a side-by-side coverage comparison. To learn more, go to buildinginsurancerisk.com. Today, my guest is Jon Howard. Jon is currently pushing the boundaries of architecture as the Associate Principal Science Sector Leader at HED, one of America's oldest and largest architecture engineering design firms. And in just a minute, we're going to talk with Jon Howard about the future of scientific workplaces. But first, a quick reminder, if you like our show, CRE Radio, there are a couple things you can do to help us out. You can like, share, and subscribe. And as always, we encourage you to leave a comment. We'd love to hear from our listeners. Also, if you want to see how handsome our guests are, be sure to check out our YouTube channel. You can find us on YouTube at Commercial Real Estate Pro Network. And while you're there, please subscribe. With that, I want to welcome my guest, Jon Howard. Welcome to CRE Radio.
Thanks, Darren. Great to be here.
I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too.
But before we jump into it, if you could take just a minute and share with the listeners a little bit about your background.
Sure. I grew up in Texas, of all places, and South Texas, San Antonio, to be exact, and started kind of gravitating toward architecture. Ended up going to grad school up here in Chicago, which is where I am now, and started my career back in 2007. So been going at it for almost 18 years. Gradually transitioned from more of a design and technical architect to a project manager, and now I'm a sector leader here at HED in science.
Got it. So in architecture, I mean, there's design of structures. I guess what I'm trying to ask is when you divide the commercial space into sectors,
Mm-hmm.
how do you define the scientific workplace?
That's a good question. We typically, so our firm we have 8 or 9 sectors right now, and what we've found over the years, so we've got everything from obviously mission critical and non-scientific workplace, if you will, and higher education and whatnot. In our science and advanced manufacturing sector, what we found over the years is, and our general philosophy is, we're not just lab designers. I mean, we are lab designers, but we also recognize that the lab is the workplace, and the workplace can also be, have some lab functions. So there's a really strong integration from people's day-to-day work experiences between, sitting at a desk, doing research, very on whatever platforms, and doing scientific work at a lab bench. There's a really tight integration there. So, what we strive to communicate to the outside world and our clients is that we really reinforce that this is a scientific workplace. It's a all encompassing environment that people go to. It's not just the lab benches; it's also the workplace side, and it all integrates together. And we want to make sure that we provide the best experiences for our clients as possible.
Got it. So in when you say like the lab space workplace, uh, talk about the lab bench,
Hmm.
and then I guess it would be office space,
Hmm.
and then what would it also have, like community space, like meeting
Yep.
rooms, and would there be other services or other types of things, elements that would fall into that? Or is that, I mean, is there any kind of industrial warehouse? Because I've been to labs, so I'm just trying to think of like, is there like a menu of things you can choose
Hmm.
from to build that out?
Yeah, it depends on what the user needs are, but what we've seen, especially if you're in a kind of a multi-tenant building, tenants typically, not always, but typically expect almost like Class A office amenities in addition to the lab spaces. So they expect to see a nice lobby space. They expect some sort of parking if you're not in a heavily public transit used area. Um, they expect either shared conference facilities or dedicated conference rooms within their suite. And obviously, the size and quantity kind of depends on what their use is. Sometimes there's robust infrastructure needs. So maybe they need a big uninterruptible power supply, space for a big uninterruptible power supply. So sometimes you have to dedicate space for specialty support equipment. Um, and then there's obviously the office space. Sometimes clients want open offices because they want a more democratic feel to their workplace. Some clients want dedicated offices for their senior staff, um, and a mix with open workstations, or some people just want all offices. So it just kind of depends on what the specific needs of that particular user is. But yeah, there's usually a wide range of spaces that could be included within a scientific workplace beyond just the lab benches.
Got it. And as far as the size of a lab workplace, um, is there a kind of a range that you've seen as far as, small to large, as far as the um, different, I guess, client designs or jobs you've had?
Yeah, I personally have experience on lab and office spaces as small as 2 to 3,000 square feet, all the way up to I think one of the largest ones I've worked on was approaching 200,000 square feet, and sometimes bigger depending on the client. Actually, one I'm working on now is a little bit bigger than that. So, uh, yeah, it can be arranged, and sometimes, especially in Chicago, or a big area that has a lot of lab, life sciences, or science users, you can have entire buildings that are dedicated, multi-story high-rise buildings that are dedicated to lab users. There's a couple here in Chicago like that. So it can range in size.
So in the space variation there, are you typically dealing with more of a tenant need, or are you ever dealing with like a new construction ground up um, lab facility?
Both. The I'll give a couple examples. We just recently completed construction on a small 12,000 square foot uh, tenant build out in a multi-tenant lab building here in the Chicago area. So that was a very much a tenant build out, coordinating with the building owner to make sure that the building can support, all their infrastructure needs, and making sure that whatever's happening inside that lab doesn't affect the building as well and other tenants within the building. So that's one project that was very much multi-tenant. Another building that I worked on in the last few years, or project that I worked on, it was a large tenant. There was a core and shell building under construction that was designed to be multi-tenant. However, they ended up working out an agreement with a single tenant. So this we helped this single tenant of around 180,000 square feet um, really design their spaces within this core and shell. That was a new construction, but it was kind of treated like an existing building because the new construction was under design, well underway before we started getting engaged with our tenant client. Um, and so that's an example where it's not it is a ground up building, but it wasn't designed for that tenant specifically. So we had to make some modifications to that building based on that tenant's needs.
Got it. And do you find typically you're working for the tenant in kind of a build out? Um, I mean, is that typically your client?
In my experience, yes. Typically, our clients are the tenants. We do occasionally, and in personal prior experience, prior to my current firm, we did have experience working on the developer side. So I worked on a project probably 6 or 7 years ago where a developer that was relatively new to the sciences bought an existing lab building that was built in the early 2000s, late 90s maybe, and was as their first foray, they were able to kind of invest um, relatively small amount into kind of lobby and core upgrades to that building, but leaving the existing labs relatively in place. And they kind of sold that to future potential tenants as, hey, you can come right out of Northwestern or University of Chicago and have some lab space ready to go. It's a little bit older lab benches, but it's there. And oftentimes when you're coming out of a university like that, you're growing quickly and you need a landing spot quickly. So that was a big selling point to them. So yeah, in my personal experience, mostly on the tenant side, but occasionally I've worked for the developer side too to help them land the tenants. And it just coincidentally, when I was working for that developer, we also ended up working for the tenants that came in. So they kind of put us forward as the building architect and engineer that could help these tenants. It wasn't mandatory for them to use us, but we ended up, hitting it off with each tenant, and they ended up using us for their services.
So I'm curious on these lab workspace build out kind of thing. Um, how does it compare to like an office as far as the frequency of refresh? Um, and I don't know what the typical cycle is, but I would think that in order to keep a building full, if you're not, you know, redoing things, and I don't know if it'd be necessarily a architectural thing
Hmm.
per se, but do you have any sense of that? Because it seems to me like a lot of the infrastructure would tend to be the same, but I don't know if
Yeah.
there's any sense of
You,
that.
in terms of refresh, you mean how often tenants are coming in and out?
Yeah, as far
Yeah.
as yeah.
Yeah. Um, it it actually, at least in the Chicago area, it can happen somewhat frequently. It just kind of depends, especially in our current market. We've got, a lot of clients and tenants are kind of coming out of these universities as they're kind of like tech startups, except they're based in the sciences. So there's a lot of capital behind them to build out these new lab spaces. They're growing quickly, sometimes, just like with a tech startup, the business doesn't work out in 2 to 3 years, and they end up having to sublease their space or find a new tenant. So you know it it's it can be as short as 3 to 4 years. They need to find a new tenant, or it can be as long as multi-decade, depending on the solidarity of that particular tenant in their business. So typically, if you're a lab user, you probably don't want to have a space that's multi-decades old for too long, because obviously science evolves, infrastructure needs evolve. But in terms of you know coming in and out of a building, a tenant could stay there multi-decades, potentially.
And would you think that some of the higher frequency, um, I guess fail, or I don't know if fail is the right word, but I mean just any kind of new business, I think
Yeah,
there's a
there's
higher
always that.
probability. Yeah.
Mhm.
Would that tend to be in those smaller spaces that you would see that kind of a turn?
That's actually a really good question. I think intuitively, yes, it would be. However, I have seen it where they've leased a whole floor of a building, and we're talking, I don't know, 25, 30,000 square feet that they leased, and they were expanding that quickly. And then for whatever reason, business reason, they ended up, their space needs changed eventually, or needed to move out. So, um, yeah, I think intuitively smaller, but oftentimes these, especially if you have really compelling technology or scientific technology that's coming out of a university research institution, you get a lot of funding really quickly. You suddenly realize you need a lot of staff really quickly. So a lot of times it can be a much larger floor plate than a smaller, like 2 to 3,000 square foot build out.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, so let me ask you, so the current um, the current space requirements, and I'm thinking more of like an overall just market uh, of the market size of the scientific workplace. Um, is it is there a number? Is there a way to quantify it? Are we oversupplied, undersupplied? Is there growing demand for this space?
It depends on your city, your location, and I think a developer probably who's in this space can probably speak a little bit more intelligently on metrics that they look at for whether or not science is an investment that they want to go into in a certain location. But I'll give, I guess, two quick examples. Um, San Diego was a big hotbed for science activity over the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years. There was a lot of activity, a lot of tenant activity, a lot of startups um, coming out of universities, coming out of other companies spun off and creating new technologies they're getting capital funding quickly and need space. And that was happening for quite a while. And then I think there was a point where the market became kind of saturated with tenant space, and it slowed down a little bit in San Diego. There are markets like within Texas, there are some markets, I think in the Austin area, Dallas area. Those are markets that we're seeing as kind of almost pre boom, if you will, because there's a lot of universities down there, a lot of brain power that's moved down there. So a lot of what we've been hearing is there's a lot of potential development on the sciences within that state because of those reasons. Chicago area, there was a lot of um, um, activity, or a lot of activity expected. So a few developers started building a lot of lab space. And in Chicago right now, we're actually a little bit oversaturated. The market, for whatever reason, just couldn't keep up with the amount of lab space that came on the market within like a period of 5 years. I think there's still hope that eventually companies will will kind of grow and move to Chicago and kind of take up these spaces. But as of right now, there's a lot of vacancy in Chicago on lab facilities. So if you're a investor or you're a company looking to move to a new facility, you might be able to get a good deal in Chicago.
Yeah. So in the areas that you've cited, you've referenced universities. Is that primarily where you see a lot, I mean, the concentration of these lab spaces? Um, are there, like you mentioned, the cities, San
Hmm.
Diego,
Hmm.
um, Texas, and Chicago? There's a pretty strong correlation there? You're not seeing these pop up in the middle of nowhere, or
Correct.
there's not some sort of a university correlation?
Yeah, there's a big university correlation. Usually, if there's like a big, especially if there's a big Ivy League presence that does scientific research, there's that makes the market more um, attractive, I guess, to developers. Obviously, Boston is still a big market for sciences, and honestly, Chicago. I remember these conversations like 5 to 7 years ago. Boston and San Diego were kind of looked at as kind of the examples that Chicago was trying to replicate because of, obviously Boston has MIT, Harvard, all those great institutions. San Diego has all their great institutions. Chicago has some great institutions too. So I think that was the logic behind developing so quickly in Chicago. And there are companies coming out of Northwestern and University of Chicago and other universities in this area. But part of what Chicago's been, from my perspective, they've been struggling to deal with, the beautiful weather of San Diego, competing against that, and obviously the brain trust in Boston area with all the great institutions and companies, and people want to be near other scientific tenants as well. So, um, yeah, university is a very strong. That's a long answer to your question. University is a very strong correlation.
No, it makes sense. I'm curious, just thinking across the different sectors of research
Hmm.
and lab. Uh, do you find is it pharmaceutical driven? Is there? I mean, I'm just trying to think. Is it bio? What are the industries that are strongest in this lab space need?
That's a good question. In the Chicago area, what we've been seeing is actually a lot of battery technology. So new and innovative ways to maximize efficiencies in batteries. So a lot of startups, we've actually been helping a handful of younger companies that have these new technologies, new patents, have gotten, a lot of funding to further their development and production of these battery technologies. So Chicago is getting stronger in that space. There's also food science a lot in Chicago. So we have a couple of larger food um, manufacturers, for lack of a better term, that have lab space for developing um, food related items. So an example was Now Foods here in Chicago area. They're famous for their vitamins and supplements, so they have a lot of lab space here, um, and they have a lot of lab need for continuing those food technologies, if you will. Some markets like San Diego traditionally were life science, pharmaceutical based. So the one client that we helped, that I worked with in San Diego, was a pharmaceutical related company that had a new technology for targeting cancer, certain cancers. And so they got a lot of patents quickly and needed a lot of space. And from what I understand, that market is heavily in the pharma space, because there's a lot of pharma representation out there. So depends on the market. San Diego is more pharma. I think Boston might be a little bit more of that too. Chicago's kind of starting to grow as more of like a battery technology, food science kind of market. maybe some pharma like CGMP, pharma manufacturing, a little bit here and there in the Chicago slash kind of northern or southwest Michigan area.
So while the university presence seems to be a natural connection, do you see, is there also any industries that you see in that same in those same cities? I mean, obviously there's a correlation there, but I was kind of curious because I'm thinking like you know, pharma. I think of a lot of times like um, well, I guess Indianapolis. I know has
Hospitals.
they've got um, is it Lilly there in
Eli
terms of
Lilly. Yeah.
yeah. But I'm just trying to get, do you see also, or do you recognize that as being part of it, or is it is the lab space kind of separate of the university and the industry, but kind of the place where all the new stuff comes out of?
Yeah. I haven't thought
So
about that too much, but
okay,
I think if I had to just going off the cuff, I think yes. I think I think what tenants are looking for is yes, proximity to the talent pool coming out of universities, but they're also looking for, and it was a big kind of rationale behind the Chicago developments that have come up over the last few years is they're finding because they're competing not only against other life or science-based tenants, they're also sometimes competing against like the tech industry with their skill sets. Like they're sometimes a proximity to that tech industry helps. And Chicago has a kind of an emerging tech industry, which has kind of helped some tenants come over to Chicago and grow in Chicago. Um, National laboratories, sometimes proximity to Department of Energy funded national laboratories is a big item. So in Chicago, we're lucky to have two Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory and Argonne National Lab. So that helps because you've got kind of a set talent pool, and sometimes you can recruit away from those or create partnerships with those national labs. Um, Also, just amenities like Chicago's a great downtown area. A lot of amenities within walking distance. Great public transportation system. Even if you're in the suburbs, you can get downtown pretty quickly using public transportation. So there's a lot of different factors that I think that they look at beyond just the universities, and I think it's like Chicago, Boston, San Diego, any sort of city that has that kind of great mix of different resources and amenities, I think is what attracts these tenants and spurs development.
yeah, that makes sense. I am just trying to think through the the different scenarios of why would and like you said the talent. I would think it'd be the the natural correlation there, and
Yeah.
then as you were talking about like the different design aspects of the buildings and the spaces, um, the just the wide variety. But I'm curious, do you see more of what you've worked on is in more like a campus setting, like some sort of a larger, like this space is designed for labs, and then the tenants in that are labs, or do you find it to be, um, is it could it be like a corporate uh, place where there's, or I guess, or could a lab be in any place that the space works for?
Yeah, it could theoretically be in any space as long as the building works for it. It depends on. So the nice thing about a campus setting, the project that I referenced earlier was that 12,000 square foot build out in a multi-tenant building. That was actually on a whole campus of buildings for science tenants. The benefit of that is you have you have a campus that's set up from an infrastructure perspective and also a management perspective, so that you know they don't have to really think too hard about coordinating nitrogen delivery or something like that. It's
Right.
it's all kind of built into that campus. So if a tenant is going into a building that may not have been designed from day one as a lab building, they'll have to kind of take that into consideration. So what if the building isn't set up for it already, what needs to be done to set them up for success when they move into the building? The building that we're in now, our office, HED, it's actually just a pretty typical Class A office building, but the floor to floor heights are enough to where there is a lab tenant in the building, or there was a lab tenant. I don't think they may not be there anymore, but so they were able to move in. There was enough, loading dock capacity and, you know, basement mechanical capacity to take on their needs. And that was, I think, the only lab tenant in our building. Um, some buildings in downtown area are just a single multi-story building designed for labs. So it's almost like a campus, but just a single building. So they are managed with that in mind. There is sufficient loading dock space for deliveries. There's sufficient bulk storage for, nitrogen tanks and helium tanks or whatever. Um, the building floor to floor height is enough for a typical lab user. The structural module, the bay space for the spacing for the structural grid is the right size, because that's another factor. You want to make sure if you're putting lab benches on a floor that you're not interrupted by a column, and minimizing impacting your efficiencies from a layout standpoint. So there's a lot of different factors that go into it. Oftentimes tenants just really like to go into something that's built day one for a lab facility, so they don't have to think too much about it, and just focus on building out.
Yeah, I'm curious, if you were to compare a lab space like what you just described to another asset class, commercial real estate asset class, is there one that you would think that it most resembles? I mean, because obviously you talk about the office space, but then you start talking about loading docks and
Yeah.
storage and stuff, and it almost makes me think some sort of an industrial
Yeah.
kind of a flex space kind of a
Hmm.
say, is that a fair comparison, or is that?
For sure. Oftentimes in a more industrial kind of space is a great spot for a lab tenant, because usually there's a decent amount of clearance from the floor to the structure. There's loading. There might be extra space around the site for bulk storage containers. So yeah, oftentimes that's an asset class that could be potentially converted into like a lab space. Another one is healthcare. That example I cited earlier was a healthcare lab building. Even if it was just a more like a clinic space, oftentimes those can be converted into like a lab space, because hospitals and clinics have a lot of that infrastructure need that labs have. So oftentimes you can convert that into kind of a lab fit out.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's one of the cool things about real estate is, all the different uses and designs,
Yeah.
and then just the different, I guess the emerging, where are we going? We saw kind of with COVID kind of changing the
Hmm.
office workspace.
Hmm.
And also I think, that combined with the Amazon effect on retail, shaking that up a little bit.
Hmm.
Um, but the need for space is ongoing. It's not like all of a sudden everybody's working from home, and
True.
clearly I would think a lab space is pretty safe. You're not going to have you know people doing experiments at home, and you know
If you're doing it right, you're not.
yeah. Yeah. Well, at least probably not intentionally anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, but it's just interesting is some of these traditional uses of space are kind of morphing in just the way people work, and
Hmm.
the opportunity to use and leverage technology to change that,
Hmm.
and how the space gets reconfigured and redesigned, and re put to different use. It's kind of it's a neat thought, as a bigger thought,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that it's such a neat thought if you're the landlord that you signed on for a big mortgage and all of a sudden nobody's coming to work
Yeah.
and you're probably facing some pain here in the near
Mm-hmm.
future,
Mm-hmm.
but that's kind of one of the beauties of the American market with there's an opportunity to win and lose
Yeah. Yeah.
based on what is, and that's kind of a different conversation. But I think
Mm-hmm.
more to this is just how the space, the opportunity for the space to be reconfigured, and if you're in the right market and you have the right demands, and that this could be a neat
Mm-hmm.
opportunity.
For sure.
Um, so
We've seen a lot of developers that traditionally hadn't invested in science, that may have invested more in the traditional office type tenant. We've been seeing more and more developers look toward science as a potential. A lot of developers and investors kind of dipping their toe in that because science, as you mentioned earlier, you have to do if you're doing lab work, you have to be in the lab to do the work. So there's a lot of it's we haven't seen the shrinking floor plates on the lab side as we have with the office side, for example, in terms of needs. There are some labs um, that have like a hybrid model where they might do lab work. I don't know, 3 days of the week, and maybe two days of the week they're doing more office work, so they might work from home. So that might affect more of the office areas a little bit more in the lab area, lab tenant fit out. But what we've seen sometimes to address that is just ensuring some sort of flexible seating arrangement, either what we call hoteling, so not having a permanent desk, just having a landing spot when you do come to the office, and you just plug right into your technology and you can do your work, or having just a flexible seating arrangement so that you know maybe you use one space to kind of serve as your 2 day a week kind of workspace, but then maybe you convert it into like a meeting space when you try to get everybody into the office for an all hands meeting or something like that. So um, but on the lab side, you know, there, because the science is so specific and you have to have that kind of lab environment to do it. That's in terms of shrinking, that's not really happening on the lab side. It's which is a good thing.
no, and the other the other cool thing is that, I mean, as with research and that, I mean, there's kind of a new frontier. I mean, there's a new problem that's trying to be solved, and
Hmm.
and the size of the opportunity isn't always known on the front end.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah.
where new industries. You mentioned batteries. I remember years ago reading an article in I don't know what it was, maybe Business Week or something like that, but I want to say it was I want to say Andy Grove, was it? That used to be the CEO for Intel.
Mm-hmm.
But he was commenting on how, and he was citing batteries specifically, how most of the batteries had been outsourced to China, and how there was this whole opportunity that was being missed with electric cars and cell phones, and all the demands we have for batteries, whereas traditionally it was thought of as your D's and C's and
Yeah.
toys kind of thing, almost
Mm-hmm.
flashlights. And to hear you talk about how that's coming back, and I mean, just it's clear that, I mean, the opportunity and the demand, and some of the questions or the conversation that I've heard talk about, just whether or not we have the infrastructure to really go fully in these directions right now is probably uh not true.
Mm-hmm.
But with the development of the technology and the research that's required to get there, there's a whole opportunity that maybe is not recognized at the front edge of that by most.
Yeah.
But like what we're talking about, all these lab spaces that then, if something does work, then you create, an industry, and it grows and it grows, and then you get competition,
Yeah.
and it's just kind of a neat
Yeah.
place to be looking forward like that. So that's
It's
cool.
Yeah, it's very interesting. That's part of the reason why I gravitated towards science and designing science spaces is because it's changing a lot. There's a lot of like I'm kind of a geek, so I like thinking about all the potential and kind of helping these clients. They're doing really complex, development of products or research, you know, trying to understand the origins of the universe or whatever. So it's really inspiring, and I really take great pride in helping those types of clients. And to your point about evolving technologies, I think it's we try to design. I think the industry as a whole tries to do this, but we definitely emphasize it as well on our end. Is try to design the space, especially if they're in a technology like batteries or what have you. Try to design it as flexible as possible, so that if there are big changes in technology, that their space can adapt to that, and that they don't have to, build from the ground up a new space, and expend a lot of dollars and capital to completely change what they're doing. So try to build as much flexibility in not only the physical space, but also the infrastructure, the systems that are supporting it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Hey, John, if we could, I'd like to shift gears here for a second.
Okay.
By day, I'm an insurance broker, and as such, I work with my clients to assess risk and determine what to do with the risk. And there's three strategies we typically consider. We first look to see if there's a way we can avoid the risk. When that's not an option, we look to see if there's a way we can minimize the risk. And if we cannot avoid nor minimize the risk, then we look to see if there's a way we can transfer the risk. That's what an insurance policy is. It's a risk transfer vehicle. And as such, I like to ask my guests if they can look at their own situation. Could be your clients, the Fed, the local jurisdiction, the um, landlords, vacancies, whatever it is that you identify, consider to be the biggest risk. And again, for clarification, while I'm an insurance broker, I'm not necessarily looking for an insurance-related answer. And so if you're willing,
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you, Jon Howard, what is the biggest risk?
I think the biggest risk, from my perspective, and I'll take, I guess, my client's perspective on this, is making sure that if you're a science-based tenant, or even a owner, like you own a building and you want to attract science-based tenants, making sure that the whatever facility they're going into, um, can meet the needs of those types of tenants. I think we've seen, luckily not too often in my own personal experience, but we have seen in the industry, a building being built, for maybe a single tenant, even if it was a lab tenant, um, being built for a tenant or a tenant type that doesn't have, the kind of the metrics that a uh, uh, science-based tenant will be looking for. So, making sure that the structural base spacing is adequate or is on an 11-foot module. That's kind of the rule of thumb, so that you can have all your benches laid out efficiently and have enough space to walk around, and not run into a column. Making sure you've got enough floor to floor height. So typically, what we try to look for with a prospective tenant is, making sure that the building can accommodate a 15-foot floor to floor height, so that they can accommodate all the ventilation systems and everything that go into a lab space. Or sometimes, if it's not that high, designing enough floor mechanical space in the floor area to kind of make up that kind of lack of ceiling area that you would be missing. So I think, just from my own perspective, especially with investors that are, or real estate developers that are looking into getting into the sciences, I think the biggest risk is landing that tenant and then the tenant not being able to get into the building, or having some serious issues with the building, that they weren't cognizant of. So what we do here at HED is often we'll work with landlords or tenants to help them assess in a building asset and make sure that it can accommodate whatever tenants they're looking for, or if it doesn't, recommend some upgrades that might be needed to attract those tenants, or in the tenant's perspective, create a list of things that need to change before you can sign a lease or what have you. So because if you're locked in and the building doesn't work, then that can be a major issue, especially for science tenants that have an ROI that they have to adhere to, and develop a product to market at a certain time frame.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If you're don't have a space that works for the tenant you're seeking, that can be problematic, and
Exactly.
a little disappointing if you were counting the commission dollars there before you were able to put that all together. That's good.
Exactly.
Hey, John, where can the listeners go if they'd like to learn more or connect with you?
Can learn more at hed.design. That's our website. You can also find me on LinkedIn, Jon Howard, Jon Howard. I'm on there and I'm relatively active, so feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Well, Jon Howard, I can't say thanks enough for taking the time to talk today.
It was awesome to talk to you, Darren. It was
likewise.
a conversation.
Yeah, no, I learned a lot, and look forward to doing it again soon.
Awesome. Sounds good.
All right. For our listeners, if you like this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Remember, the more you know, the more you grow. That's all we've got this week. Till next time, thanks for listening to Commercial Real Estate Pro Network's CREPN Radio.
You're listening to CREPN Radio for influential commercial real estate professionals. For more information on this or any of our guests, like us on Facebook, CREPN Radio.